I'm also going to talk about something that I haven't really talked about anywhere else because I know this is a podcast for and by writers.
Hello and welcome to Collected, the podcast about writing from the Royal Literary Fund. I'm Anne Morgan, a writer and Royal Literary Fund Fellow. This episode, we are going to be taking a deep dive into the Royal Literary Fund archives. Over the last 10 years or so, the RLF has built up an amazing bank of recordings, of conversations between writers and talks by writers about different aspects of the writing life. And I think what's really special about this archive of recordings is that normally, we hear from writers when things are going well, when a book's out or there's a prize that they've won or there's an exciting adaptation of their work coming out on TV, which is great. It's great to celebrate those successes. But sometimes that can give a slightly misleading impression of what the writing life involves, because as any of us who have had a career in writing, who have been writers for any length of time know, there are highs and lows. And for many of us, even those who've had great success, there can be periods where there are challenges and difficulties and it's hard to see the way ahead. So what's great about the Royal Literary Fund archive is it gives more of a rounded picture of the jobbing writer's life, of the reality of what it means to try and live as a writer and to try things and sometimes to fail. And so with that in mind, I'm really excited to be joined by a special guest who I'm hoping to bring into conversation with some of those clips from the archive and to see whether they resonate or what ideas or reflections they throw up. And our special guest today is not only a fabulous writer, an international bestseller, but also a friend. And it's a real treat to be joined by Laura Barnett today in the studio. Laura, how are you? How are you doing?
I'm not too bad at all. I'm very happy to be here with you, Anne. Thank you for having me.
Where do we find you on the writing journey at the moment? How are you feeling about writing right now?
Well, it's funny. I'm right in this very particular place between delivering a finished manuscript and sort of starting to cogitate and germinate the next one. So my fifth novel, Births, Deaths and Marriages, has gone to my editor and that will be published in June 2025. And I'm now thinking about what to write next and enjoying that moment of turning over different ideas in my head and sort of sowing them in the field and seeing which seedlings come up.
Oh, it's a lovely image, sowing them in the field. Now, we met when our debut novels were just coming out. I think they came out the same year. And your debut, The Versions of Us, was one of the big books of that year. I mean, I think 24 languages it was published in.
Yes, I think it might be 26 now.
26? Oh my goodness, it just keeps increasing. And much deserved success and praise and many, many thousands of readers around the world. It's a fabulous story that explores what might be if a tiny detail is different at the start of two lives and brings together three versions of the same love affair, really, love story. Births, Deaths and Marriages. Can you give us a kind of overview of what we've got to look forward to from that?
So Births, Deaths and Marriages tells the story of 6 interconnected characters, all of whom have been friends at university. And we meet them, well, about 2 decades later as they're all turning 40. So there's been quite a lot of time between when their friendship was really strong and where they are now. So we're in around 2023, 2024, so it's post-pandemic UK, and they're all navigating the realities of their lives. Since the pandemic, it's changed their lives in various ways, as it has for everybody. And so we see them across a year as they reconnect. We see a birth, a death and a marriage, and we don't know whose is going to be whose and how it's going to affect them. So I guess it's about, how we're all living now in this changed landscape after the pandemic, how that's affected us, how it's affected our jobs, and also our broader sense of mortality, I suppose. The fact that even those of us lucky enough to be fairly healthy in our 30s and 40s were brought up short. We were brought up close. We saw people we knew, older, younger, maybe even the same age, fall very ill, maybe die. We lost people we loved. The world changed. Our freedoms were lost. And I think it also affected the way we felt about relationships and the way we wanted to or didn't want to connect with those who'd once mattered to us.
Yeah, wow. Well, it sounds fabulous and very timely. I'm sure lots of people will be rushing to get their copies. But of course, getting to that point of publishing your 5th novel, that's a long journey. And I wanted to start off by thinking about the formative aspect of your writer's life and the reading that might have gone into building you as a writer and how stories sort of shaped you. So to get us thinking about that, I've got a first clip from the archives, which is a talk by a writer I really admire called Ian Ayres. His first novel, Abide With Me, really gripped me. It has a massive picture of a football on the cover, which was an instant turn-off for me. I'm not very interested in football. But I've found over the years that a measure of a good book is that if the subject matter is not something that you're interested in, but the writer can draw you in anyway, that's something special. And Ian's storytelling is so fresh and powerful. And I think he brings that into his biographical writing too. This talk that he wrote a few years ago about the stories that shaped him is really powerful, and I'd love to get your thoughts on it.
The stories of my life. The American writer Edgar Allan Poe once wrote a story of a man dogged by a mirror image of himself. A stranger who turns up in times of crisis to reveal the man to be morally corrupt. The story ends with a man running the stranger through with a sword, thus killing himself in the process. My life hasn't been quite so gothic, but it has been a life defined by reflection. I was born in Dagenham, 1969, an identical twin. Even now, in my 50s, I am still mistaken for my brother. My life has been one of constant comparison, a life dominated by a search for my own identity. I am a walking simile, unable to escape the prison of mirrors I was born into. My mum dressed us the same for a while. We went to the same schools, played for the same football teams. We were known as the twins, or sometimes individually as Twinny. And all this time I looked on from the outside, observing, trying to find the details that might define the difference between us. My observing turned to daydreaming, spending much of my time staring out of the classroom window, and I soon fell behind my brother at school. As my brother studied Shakespeare, I was sitting at the front of the class down the corridor, explaining to the lad next to me that live, as in the verb, and live, as in the adjective, are spelt the same but mean different things. I can see his burnished apple-round face now, raging at me for apparently winding him up. It was at this time I'd begun to read through the Charles Dickens books I'd seen at my nan and granddad's house. The focus Dickens placed on the downtrodden and the dispossessed appealed to me immediately. I fell in love with his use of words. Even though I understood probably less than half, it didn't matter. They sounded so playful, so beautiful and so amazing. And the fact he had literally made me laugh out loud, and still does, was a huge thing for me. I became joyfully lost amongst the ragged inhabitants of Victorian London, its dreary courtyards and narrow streets. The world Dickens created became a place within me, a place I could retreat to when my own world became too much. It is a place, in many ways, I have never truly left. Looking back, I can see my failure at school was an unconscious effort to create a tangible difference between myself and my brother, something others could use to tell us apart. I left school at 15 as my brother continued his education. A poem by Walt Whitman called There Was a Child Went Forth tells of a boy who everything he experiences becomes a part of him. Stories became that for me. Stories became the way I made sense of everything and my insulation from a series of grim experiences in the world of work in which I found myself. I remember trying to read The Outsider by Albert Camus as I and 3 or 4 other lads bounced around in the back of a white van on the way to a day's work in a gin factory. I was meant to work there for a week, but a day was all I could manage in that gin-soaked circle of hell. I next found myself working in a factory that made doors for the backs of lorries, spending much of my time putting nuts and bolts and various other necessary fixings for the construction of the doors into small brown boxes, wrapping them in tape and labelling them with a marker pen. Break times were spent in the factory canteen, where I found myself almost the only one not eating a bacon sandwich and reading the Sunday Sport or some other dubious publication. Ridiculed for being a vegetarian and for reading actual books, I would climb one of the 30-foot stacks of cardboard in the factory at lunch, do some yoga there and read. I vividly remember being up there reading Voltaire's Candide, as well as Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance by Robert Pirsig. Again, that need to carve an identity, a world of my own, seems obvious now, but back then it felt more like surviving. I worked in that factory for 5 years. The characters from the stories I read, my constant companions. At 27 years old, I was struggling in a difficult marriage and, in terms of where I was going in my life, was utterly without direction. I needed to get away. I needed a space to reflect. Armed with a rucksack full of bits and pieces from a list I'd taken from a camping magazine, a tent, a sturdy pair of walking boots and several maps, not that I could read maps very well, but I felt better for having them there, I set off. I had the vague idea of getting to Denmark and heading south for Italy, but no real plan. I boarded a ferry at Harwich in Essex and headed for the Danish coast. Tucked into the top of my rucksack was a journal, a paperback copy of Peter Pan by J.M. Barrie, and Gitanjali, a book of Indian poetry by Rabindranath Tagore.
So, Laura, I just wondered what you make of that, first of all, of how that resonates with you as a writer.
I just thought that was the most beautiful piece. I mean, not only beautifully written, but so honest and wide-ranging and, just fantastic to listen to. And as you say, so much to chew on there. Yes, I mean, I absolutely related to this idea of stories being a refuge and a source of identity. I think that was the same for me. You'd probably struggle to find a writer who wouldn't say that on some level. I mean, my mum jokes that she taught me to read essentially so that she could get a little bit of time to herself. She was a single mum from when I was 5, and she taught me to read apparently at age 3, although I suspect this may be a little earlier than it really was. I don't know. But certainly I was sitting and reading happily for hours, apparently by around the age of 5 or 6. And I can certainly remember just how completely transporting I found the books I loved at the time. Apparently, the first books I really, really loved were Tolkien, The Hobbit, and also the C.S. Lewis Narnia. I mean, obviously, I'm talking about after all the kids' books. Obviously, I'm not talking at 2 or 3 reading Tolkien.
I don't know, Laura. I can believe it. I can believe
it. I do remember loving The Very Hungry Caterpillar as well, which my own 4-year-old son now loves too. But yeah, it's interesting because these kinds of novels are now so far from my taste and the kind of things that I write and the kind of things that I consume. But I really, really did love all that kind of high fantasy as a child, the C.S. Lewis, the Tolkien. I suppose it was this sense of entering a completely new fantastical landscape where everything was made in the way the writer wanted, and that sense of control, because frankly, as a child, my family situation was not terribly happy, and I was an only child and spent a lot of time alone. And while I broadly recall a happy childhood, it was one in which that imaginative landscape that I could inhabit, firstly as a reader and then as a writer, was a sort of escape, a sort of refuge. Funnily enough, I have never learnt to love Dickens. So that's one place where Ian and I differ. I feel like this must be a failing in me rather than in Dickens, because I know how loved he is by so many. But yeah, and then I also really related to the part where Ian talked about writing maybe being the place where he finds the broken pieces of himself. Across the 5 novels that I've published so far and the several others that are, in the back catalogue, where we all have these books that have never seen the light of day and never should, I have realised that although I don't write expressly about myself or have rarely done so, things that I'm going through, things that I'm feeling subconsciously, or just things that I'm interested in and trying to sort of penetrate and understand will worm their way into the books. And I think that was happening from a really early age. So I was writing first poetry, then stories, and then full novels, from 5, 6, 7 onwards. I think the first full novel I completed was a work of Beatles fan fiction. I remember a very memorable New Year's Eve when I was 13, spent not going out clubbing in London, although that did come later, but sitting around all night trying to work out how to play And I Love Her on guitar, which is actually harder than it sounds. So yes, Meet the Beatles was my first full work of fiction in which a girl not unlike me travelled back in time to meet Paul McCartney.
Okay, well, so Meet the Beatles may not have hit the dizzy heights, but your first novel, The Versions of Us, did in a big way. Massive success, a real, as we mentioned earlier, a real sort of global phenomenon, I think it's fair to say, and fantastic, how exciting, and for many writers, the absolute dream. But I know that from the outside, these things can often look glossier than they sometimes feel. And I wondered if we could think a little bit about success from the inside, or that experience, that sudden sort of, explosion, really, particularly for a debut writer. I mean, it must bring in a range of feelings and experiences. And to help us think about that a bit more, I wanted to bring in some words from a writer who's had a similar experience, although it happened later in her career. Claire Chambers had published 8 novels before Small Pleasures in 2020 took the world by storm. And it is a fantastic read. I love that book. But Claire had some interesting things to say about how it felt from the inside to go through that experience. So we'll listen to that now.
I mean, it wasn't one of those books that was a success pre-publication. Although 3 publishers had bid for it, it wasn't what you'd call a kind of an auction. I sort of think of it as more of a boot fair, really, because I didn't get a huge amount of money for it. And the 3 publishers who were interested all offered the same amount. So there wasn't a question of them outbidding each other. It was just, this is what we're offering. Which of us do you want to go with? The advance was similar to what I'd received for my other unsuccessful books. So I had that slight presentiment that things were not going to be any different this time than they had been in the past. It was quite late on that the feedback from social media when proofs went out was starting to be very positive, and they put a beautiful jacket on the book. The publisher just did a really good job of getting it into the hands of people who might have enjoyed it. And social media had obviously completely changed the marketing arena since the last time I was published. When I was first published, the publishers would say things like, "Oh, this is such a word of mouth book." And you think, by which you mean there is no budget for publicity.
Yeah, not going to spend any money.
Not going to spend any money. Because word of mouth in the days of pre-social media was useless. I mean, how long does it take somebody to read a book, recommend it to their next door neighbour over the fence, and then them to read it? I mean, word of mouth has no effect in the days before social media. But now, word of mouth is incredibly useful and powerful. And somebody with 70,000 followers recommends a book in the warmest possible terms. It's really useful. I suppose just before publication, I started to feel a sort of fluttering of anxiety that maybe this was going to be quite successful. And I got that sort of dreadful fear of success, which is the other side of the coin from fear of failure, which had been my previous companion throughout my career. It was generally all very pleasant. It does make you sort of rethink your sense of yourself, because I'd obviously developed a sense of myself as being somebody who was, an underachiever. And that had been sort of a core part of my personality for many years. And then suddenly, to have that taken away from me, cruelly snatched away from me, I had to sort of reimagine myself as somebody who might even perhaps be an overachiever and have been overestimated in my abilities. And I had to sort of rethink my position. And of course, then you start to worry that, having had all this positive publicity and great sales and people being generally seeming to like the book and it's selling and actually earning some money, you think, well, this is a trick you can only play once, because next time the sort of rags to riches goodwill is not there. You can really only play the card of this poor undiscovered writer once, and I've already played my joker now, and so the next book I feel is almost doomed to disappoint. So obviously that's something in the back of my mind as I write.
So, Laura, Claire Chambers there, very funny, really, in what she says about that experience. But you can tell from her words, at least I feel you can, that, it's really quite a whirlwind of feelings and things to deal with. How did it compare? How does that compare? Does anything there resonate for you with your experience with the versions of us?
Definitely. As I was listening to that, as you say, brilliantly funny and insightful piece, I was remembering a conversation I had with the author Kathy Rensenbrink around the time that the versions of us was doing really well. And she had a memoir, The Last Act of Love, out at the time, which was also doing well. So we saw each other sort of on the event festival circuit. And I remember we had a conversation about some of the struggles we were having, and we sort of had a glint in our eyes as we looked at each other. And she said, "Oh yes, it's very much a my diamond shoes are too tight situation. Like, you feel that you shouldn't complain." And certainly, I wasn't complaining in any significant way, but we were discussing the fact that, I think when you've always dreamt of something happening and then it happens, that is obviously an enormous privilege and a wonderful thing, and I would not wish it any other way. But I think when it happens with a debut, it's maybe particularly challenging and maybe quite different in a way from Claire's experience. She's remained very level-headed, I think, throughout. But when your first book opens so many doors and creates so much enthusiasm from within the publishing industry and from readers, and keeps you very busy, sort of travelling around up and down the country internationally as well. Yeah, it was a whirlwind, and it inevitably created, I think, an expectation that each novel would look like that. And that hasn't been the case. I'm also going to talk about something that I haven't really talked about anywhere else, because I know this is a podcast for and by writers. And the fact is that the novel, The Versions of Us, was not and has not been successful in all the territories in which it was published, significantly America. So the novel went to auction here in the UK first. There were 7 publishers vying. It was quite a big sort of news story within the industry. There was a lot of buzz. There's people called scouts who are often freelance or they're employed by sometimes TV and film agencies or other publishers around the world. And their job is to sort of keep abreast of what's big and what's new. And so a lot of those were reading the versions of us I know now. I've met a few of them since. And we got a lot of interest from American publishers before it had been published here, before it had even actually been bought here. And in the end, it was bought for a vast sum of money and something called a preempt, which meant the publishers, Houghton Mifflin, basically blasted everyone else out of the water with a sum so significant that my husband and I used quite a lot of it, like to buy a house with. And I remember just after we'd signed that deal, a couple of months later, my agent phoning and saying, I've got some really bad news. And I was like, oh dear. I remember I was getting on the tube at the time and I just had like 2 minutes of signal before it would disappear. And she said, your editor in the US is leaving. And I was like, oh, is that a big deal? But it did prove to be quite a big deal. And I think other writers listening may have had this experience too. You know, you're bought by a particular editor. And if that's, you know, involved quite a large investment, they've had to really get everybody on board. And often what happens when they leave, because obviously they leave the novel behind with the publisher that bought it, they don't take it with them to their new job, then it can often happen that the novel gets sort of slightly forgotten or lost in all the noise of, you know, the new editor that comes in isn't necessarily as invested in the project as the previous one. Now, I'm not going to necessarily say that was the case in my instance. I think the new editor did her best, but for whatever reason, the novel, which had made a big kerfuffle stateside when it was bought, and I was flown over to New York. I met the main buyer at like a Borders bookstore, and I went over to a big expo in, I don't even remember where now, somewhere cold, Denver, Colorado, and met this person and that person, all these indies, and did all these kind of pre-interviews, and it was all just so exciting. You know, I remember staying in New York for 3 days at their cost and it just being like, this is so great, this is the start of everything. And then it just didn't sell. It just didn't sell in the way they'd wanted it to. I think the sales figures were incredibly disappointing. And that's affected my ability to sustain a career in America ever since. Now, I appreciate even to have been in a position to be talking about that is, again, a privilege and not one afforded to all writers. But I think sad and depressing and hard as that's been, it's probably been quite good at keeping me grounded.
Yeah. I've seen quite often on social media recently people talking about writers defining their own idea of success. What does success mean to you? And that's the way to sustain a career. If you kind of know what looks successful to you, it doesn't really matter what other people's yardsticks are. But that's sometimes easier said than done, isn't it? Particularly, as you say, when you've had a big success with something, it's very hard not to compare and not to sort of have your expectations slightly recalibrated by that, I think. Thank you. That's really, so interesting to hear that backside of the tapestry story, I think, because we so rarely hear those things. And I think it is really helpful to see that it is often a much more mixed picture than it might appear. Now, a challenge that people often refer to as the pram in the hallway. Parenthood and writing, in many people's eyes, is not an easy mix. And I remember meeting you again a few years after we'd met when our debuts came out to record a talk and an interview, in fact, at the time, not long after your son was born. And I remember being rather intimidated because you delivered this beautiful talk, which we're going to listen to now, and told me that you'd written it in the space of a couple of hours, I think, because there'd been so little time juggling everything else that you were doing. And I was a bit sort of intimidated by that because I thought, wow, it was so polished and so impressive. And I was really struck by how amazing it was that you'd been able to do that.
Time and the writer. Before I had my son Caleb in February 2020, I was terrified of many things. Childbirth, naturally. That something might go wrong for me or for him as a result of one of the many complications I'd endured through my pregnancy. That my husband and I would never sleep again. That we would have no idea how to look after this baby and would end up doing something horribly, horribly wrong. But near the top of this list of fears was another one more personal, perhaps even more deeply rooted. The fear of losing time. The fear of never, for the rest of my life, finding another moment to write a word. For a writer becoming a mother, or facing any other kind of major life change, this fear is real. When you earn your living by writing, and by teaching or talking about writing, precariousness is woven into the fabric of your life. So many things can go wrong. Illness, poor sales, fickle publishers, agents changing career, writer's block, that bogey monster we all try to pretend doesn't exist. That I myself was convinced didn't exist, until it came and sat on my keyboard for months on end, telling me that every word I wrote was rubbish, utterly hackneyed and meaningless. And then there's the question of time, the commodity that almost all of us feel we lack, and yet spend profligately phone scrolling and watching TV, like problem gamblers transfixed by slot machines, losing pennies by the minute. As writers, we tell ourselves we need time. We need reams of the stuff, luxuriant hours with nothing to do but sit at our computer and think and write and edit and stare and read and do all the things we writers have to do to get a book, script, screenplay or poem out of our heads and onto the page. This, anyway, is what many of us think we need. I hear it all the time from the many emerging writers I teach and mentor. I really want to finish my novel, many of them say, but I'm so busy, I just don't have time. They tell me that things will be different when their kids start school, or when they retire, or when they move to an isolated cave on a Hebridean island. Then they'll have time to write, they say. Then they'll get their book finished. I used to think this way too, and I'm here today, on the other side of motherhood, with a toddler, 3 teaching jobs, 3 novels on the go, a house that's basically falling to bits, and a million other demands on my time, to reassure other writers, and my own fearful past self, that this idea is absolutely false.
So, Laura, how do you feel now, listening to that a few years on?
It's so strange hearing your own voice, isn't it? Apart from cringing massively inwardly. I still agree with that version of myself. Yeah, I do. I mean, my son is 4 now. He starts school in September. And in the last few months, without boring readers rigid with the intricacies of my sort of schedule, we've had a few changes in the sort of childcare situation. So actually, I have ended up with less time than I did. His nursery hours changed. But I haven't been less productive. No, I mean, I've completed a novel in that time and done a PhD thesis, not quite a full-length one, but still a substantial piece of work, and as well as working and teaching. And I don't know, I think I've always been quite... My mum says I work smart. Maybe I do, I don't know. I tend to be able to focus in quite quickly and quite productively. But I do still pass that advice to other writers, and I do still think it stands. I think we can persuade ourselves that we need, 6 or 7 hour days, empty diaries in order to get ourselves into the headspace to write. But I think a lot of that is resistance and procrastination. And the actual business of writing, I think we can get in there, we can get something done in half an hour, 45 minutes. And it's the consistency, it's the practice, it's the coming back every day to get it built. There is one caveat I will add that maybe I didn't go into in that talk and that I would add now. I think the thing that is harder, perhaps, when you have more demands on your time, and certainly as a parent, is what I tend to think of as the kind of filling of the creative reservoir. So I tend to when I write a novel, I tend to picture this body of water, this reservoir that is creativity. And every time you write, you draw from it. And by the end of a novel, it's quite empty, right? It's like there's been a drought and, it hasn't rained for a while and it needs refilling. And before having Caleb, before moving to the countryside where I now live, basically in the middle of a field, I used to live in a big city. I used to live in London, and I would fill that reservoir by getting out in the world in whatever way I could, going to galleries, reading a lot more than I do now, lots of different cultural events, just sort of being in the world. And I think that part of the writer's life is one that, I don't often hear talked about a lot. and is one that really matters, I think. And B, one that is definitely harder to make time for when you have more demands on that time. As a sort of single girl about town, or even a married girl about town, that was a lot easier than as a mum.
That's really, really interesting and really well put as well. I think it's very easy often to feel that if you're not putting words on the page or doing something that you can show a result from quickly, that you're not achieving anything or you're not making progress. Something I've always admired about you is you are very disciplined and you are very good at delivering on what you promise, in that you will say, right, I'm going to write this novel about this, and you set out and you do it. My creative process really doesn't work like that. I tend to subvert things, and if I say I'm going to do something, I'll end up doing something totally different, or the thing won't work, and I have to find ways around that. But I wanted to think a bit more about that routine, that process. And to help us do that, I've got quite short clip from Basir Sultan Kazmi, the Urdu poet and playwright. And I just wanted to see what your response to this was.
I don't force myself to write. I try to keep it natural. As Keats said, that poetry should grow as naturally as leaves on tree. And Mirza Ghalib, the great poet from the subcontinent, in one of his Persian couplets, he says that the verse itself expresses the desire to be composed by me. So the verse chooses the poet. Now, in my case, the thing to be written chooses the time, place, and also the form. A word, a phrase, or a line from a conversation or wave of thought starts the process. I don't have any routine or rituals to help me get started or keep going. It can happen anywhere, anytime. Sometimes when I'm extremely busy, a phrase from somewhere, some idea. It's a mystery. Every writer has said something about that where the idea comes from airy nothing. And then, of course, I am just be with that idea along with my other occupation or whatever I'm doing. Sometimes I take a break. Sometimes the idea forces me to take a break whenever possible, but I don't force a break. And then when I find the opportunity, the next possible available opportunity, I make a note of it on any piece of paper that I can get hold of. Any piece. I mean, there are so many examples.
What's your response listening to that?
I think there are two things. I mean, wonderful, such a great account of that, what Ted Hughes called the thought fox, this idea of inspiration striking and scampering across the page and how you have to capture it. I definitely relate to that. I don't really carry notebooks. I have tried. I remember hearing other writers talking about carrying notebooks, and I once bought a whole load of them, but I'd always forget which handbag they were in or lose them somewhere. So I have to say, prosaically, I do just jot things on my phone, on my notes function on my iPhone. So I do really relate to that. But I would say I relate less to not having a routine or a sense of sort of necessity of production. I think it may be different for a poet. It's a different form, of course, but long form work, especially long form work that helps pay your mortgage, has to have a production process attached to it, or bills don't get paid. So there is sort of work ethic attached to it. But one thing I did want to say about that work ethic, and it took me a while to learn this, I think, because like so many of us, particularly sort of born and raised in the global north, I was raised with, I guess, a sort of fairly Protestant Anglo-Saxon work ethic, I suppose, of this idea that you work hard, you work a certain number of hours. Once I left full-time employment and was working as a writer, I think I transferred over this idea that a writer's day would start at 9 and finish at 5, and that we would expect to be productive for most of that time. And actually, it took me quite a while, and it's about 10 years now that I've been a published writer and earning most of my living from that, to realise that creativity doesn't work like that. And I do agree with the speaker about that it doesn't respond to any sort of strict principle of how long you will work for. For me, I can be productive for an hour or two, and then the rest of the day might be editing or doing other bits and bobs that sort of contribute to that broader project or teaching or whatever else I need to do to pay the bills. So I do have a routine, but I would agree that creativity does not look necessarily like a post-industrial kind of, production line.
When you say be productive, do you have in mind a certain word count, or is it a quality of writing you're looking for, or how does that play out?
No, I do. I have a 1,000-word target. I need to write 1,000 words a day when I'm producing a first draft. If I'm unwell, I suffer from migraines, so I'm quite often not in a great headspace, or I need to rest or something. I will be reasonably flexible with that. But I'll normally be flexible because the day before I exceeded that and went to 2,000 or 3,000. But it's very rare for me to write more than 2,000 decent words in a day.
Now, you mentioned earlier that you moved from the city to the country a few years ago. And I wanted to finish off by thinking about location and how that feeds into or doesn't into our writing. And to help us do that, I have a talk from the crime writer David Mark.
I'm David Mark. Locations. I'm a method writer. It sounds unbearably pretentious, and it probably is. But I don't wear cravats or smoke a pipe, and if you ask me what I do for a living, I tend to answer with something glib, so I do feel entitled to indulge in this one little display of absurd pomposity for the sake of my art. My stories are born of location. I can't write about a landscape until I've walked around in it, laid in it, listened to it, breathed it in and generally snuffled about like a dog leaving its scent. I find a spot that speaks to me, and I tune myself into the vibrations. I let myself go. What can only be described as slack, loose, untethered. I drift. I flick through the almanac of characters who roost like gargoyles and griffins in my skull. I look at the world through somebody else's eyes. And a story happens. It's a while before it becomes a book, but that's the moment of conception. The earth sometimes moves. Which is why I'm lying beside a grave in an abandoned churchyard just outside the village of Gilsland. It's a place on the edge of things, a spider at the centre of a web of county lines. Hadrian's Wall runs through the centre. Scotland's soft purple heathers can be glimpsed beyond the forest. It's Cumbria, but the dialect is Geordie, and its inhabitants head east, not west, when they think of shopping trips and takeaways. And I'm propped up against the curlicued, wind-blasted headstone of a reiver who died in her 103rd year. I'm staring up at a sky that presses down upon the landscape like a dirty hand. There's a storm coming. The clouds are a hill of dead doves, all grey and purple, silver and muddy white. I'm thinking of foxgloves pulped against stone. Thinking of my nana and grandad, who grew up a few miles west. Good storytellers were Phyllis and Joe. Could describe the winter and make you shiver, even when you were sitting in their back room, cheek crimson from the Rayburn and teeth tingling from the too-sweet tea. Bad that year, said Nana Phyllis. 67, was it? 68? I was wet down to me second vest. I read up on it, journalist that I was. She'd undersold it. Floods that had the agnostics gripping their rosaries afresh. It would be a week before they saw blue again. A week before the clouds rained themselves out. The tide rose 6 feet that fortnight. They had to evacuate half of Haltwhistle. Bones rose from the churchyards like worms. I lay in the grave and imagined myself to be somebody else. Imagined myself an interloper, a newcomer, an incomer in this community of old bones, old blood. I wasn't uncomfortable, just breathing it all in. Damp grass, mud, that high meat and camphor whiff of unloved furs. My clothes sticking to my skin, grass prickling the skin of my wrists. A long-necked daisy's grown between the fingers of my left hand. I wonder how long it would take for the earth to claim me. I have a vision of myself, semi-consumed, a risen hump of grass and cow parsley and buttercups split into sods with the gravedigger's spade. I find myself staring out at the little grey mausoleum that stood at the rear of the churchyard. Were I a painter, this would be the section of the landscape that I would have chosen to paint. cosy in a Gothic sort of a way, squatting in a pocket of gloom, shielded by the purple leaves of an overhanging tree. Moss grew on its walls, as if the stone was a living thing that somehow provided nutrients. I saw swifts flitting in and out of the elaborate eaves. This is Over Denton. I'm near the train tracks. There's a garage a little way back that contains the rusted skeleton of motorcycles and lawnmowers, great double-pronged forks and static buzzsaws clotted up with wood dust. A village shaped like a crucifix, the cross-section formed by a straight grey road that ran parallel to the train tracks. 3 houses at the top of the village and a couple more sloping away down the hill. Ragged outbuildings and crumbling barns. Then the church. Beyond that lay the river and the trees and endless miles of nothing at all. The rain's coming down now. The mist shivers and becomes a downpour. I don't move. I'm onto something. There's an idea in there somewhere. A story about Gilsland and the old prisoner of war camp a couple of miles back down the hill. We saw a work party once, said Nana Phyllis. They were polite, but I ran like I was being chased by the devil. She told me about Blue Streak too, Britain's rocket programme, based at RAF Spade Adam. I didn't know we'd been in the space race, or that Britain had pulled up lame long before Yuri Gagarin went looking for God in the cosmos. Gilsland was a boomtown post-war. The windows rattled every time the bowler-hatted ministry men popped up from London to witness another test flight. Sound barriers popped like champagne corks. There was money in Gilsland for a while. The locals signed the Official Secrets Act. They learned to listen out for Russian accents, even as they corresponded with their former POWs, now home in Germany, and grateful for the kindness shown during their sojourn in the borderlands. There's a story here. A storm, a mausoleum, secrets, lies. Lightning is going to fork down from the sky and split that tree. A branch is going to clatter down onto the old mausoleum in a cloud of rags and dust and bones. There'll be a new body amid the rubble, a body that doesn't belong there. And whoever's lying here, in this grave, will see it all. She won't be able to leave things alone. She'll need a confidant. She'll need my Nana in her youth. I'm thinking like her now, thinking like my next protagonist. I'm seeing my Nana through her eyes, assessing, judging. Turns out I can be a nasty, cynical cow when I'm riled. I'm seeing Phyllis, seeing her neat little home. She's peeling potatoes, picking elderberries, scrubbing medicated shampoo into some pale-skinned little ruffian's hair. She's older than me, whoever I am. Mid-30s, though. With the fashions in this godforsaken hole, it's never easy to be sure. Women start dressing like their grandparents as soon as they push out a bairn. I don't like it here. I'm an outsider, certainly. Clever and withering and full of a sadness I can't work out. I'm holding flowers suddenly, laying them on my child's grave. I'm broken, bereaved. I don't move until I'm wet down to my second vest. I take a picture of the grave, of the church, of the drunken tombstones and the tree. I pat the landscape like it's been a good dog. Thank it for whatever magic it has worked on my behalf. Walk back to the car through the rain, gestating the novel like a fetus. 9 months later, it's a book, and I'm laid out on another patch of grass beneath a different sky.
So, Laura, quite an evocative picture there of an engagement with the landscape and how that feeds into the creative process. I wondered how landscape works for you and whether moving from the city to the countryside, I mean, you talked about the difference in feeding the creative process, but in terms of the writing, how has that affected you? Has it affected you?
Yes, I mean, such a beautiful piece there, so evocative. I could picture every aspect of that landscape and the people in it. It's interesting. I think about place and I teach it a lot. And recently I did an exercise with some students I'm teaching at the moment that drew on something that Andrew Marr raised in a talk. I gave a TEDx talk back in 2017, which remains one of the most terrifying things I've ever done. It was at Cambridge University, and one of the other speakers on the bill that day was Andrew Marr. And I had the joy of listening to him, and he was brilliant and barely needed any notes. And he talked about the concept of somewheres and anywheres. So something that had become quite current. I think it was the author David Goodhart who came up with this idea, this dichotomy that in his view possibly underlay some of the fury around Brexit and some of the general sort of movements towards division and polarity in politics in the UK and beyond at the moment. And it wasn't a concept I'd come across before. So the idea really is that a somewhere person is someone who has perhaps grown up in one very particular place and feels very rooted to that place, is very attached to it. But then an anywhere person is someone who perhaps lives in a big city or certainly feels that they could live anywhere, kind of like a global nomad, I suppose, would be a phrase that we'd use now. I mean, it's a little reductive as a description, but that's the essential difference. And what I had my students doing in the class I ran recently was thinking about where their characters lay on that continuum. Were they somewhere people or anywhere people, and how does that outlook influence their relationship with place and the way that they see the world, and therefore, by extension, how much of a sense of place would we get through that character's eyes? And it's something that made me think naturally about my own work as well. So I grew up in South London, and I think perhaps for that reason, like many city dwellers, the numbers of us who actually were born and grew up in London itself is probably fairly small compared with people who maybe moved to the city later in life. But I feel like an anywhere person. So, I mean, I lived most of my life in London. I also lived in Cambridge for university and in Rome, because I studied Italian. But I would say that until I left London in 2020, I wouldn't necessarily have said that place was a particularly important or sort of fundamental factor in my work, not in the way that this writer that we've been listening to described it. The Versions of Us is probably quite a good example of a kind of anywhere novel that trots quite happily from Cambridge to London to Cornwall to France, Paris to New York to Italy, and most places that I know. And I suppose, like the writer, I do like to draw on places that I have walked across, that I feel, that I know intimately.
In your novel Gifts, there's a caravan, maybe you were about to bring it up.
Yeah.
That you found in a field.
There is. Exactly. So Gifts, my third novel, which I wrote through sort of end of 2020 and into 2021, that's the novel I was talking about actually when I talked about writing something when my son was still really small. That is the first novel that really is very much informed by a very specific sense of place. And that's perhaps when I felt like I was maybe becoming more of a somewhere person. So I moved to a very rural area in Kent, and I think I probably was looking with an outsider's eye, and I was very interested in this new landscape, these huge skies, these big fields that I was stomping across, trying to push a pram across a field that's just been ploughed. I can tell you, it's not a good idea. I soon abandoned the pram. So yeah, that novel Gifts, which is a novel in short stories set at Christmas in a fictional version of Faversham. So it's a town I called Lenbourne. I created some problems for myself because I sort of renamed some of the streets in Faversham, and now occasionally if I try to call a taxi, I'll use the wrong name that I used in the novel. People get confused. But yes, that is really a hymn to mid-Kent, North Kent, where I live. I live in a slightly borderland between mid and North Kent. I'm not really quite sure which one it is. But yeah, there's marshes and big skies and sort of muddy seas and muddy fields and oast houses. I live in an old oast myself. So that is a novel informed by place. But generally, I think Births, Deaths and Marriages, again, it's mainly set in London. There's some bits of Kent. I think for me, it's much more about the characters and their internal landscape that interests me most. And yes, place matters to me in terms of building a convincing, realistic picture of where they are and immersing the reader. But I haven't, with the exception of Gifts, that's perhaps the only novel that's sort of been born of a place in the way that writer describes, of that landscape sort of suggesting the tenor and timbre and feel mood of the novel overall.
Mm-hmm. Well, Laura, thank you so much. You've been so generous with your time and your ideas, and it's been brilliant to hear your responses to some of the archive findings today. So thank you for joining us. You've been listening to Collected, the podcast about writing from the Royal Literary Fund. If you'd like to share any comments or questions, please use the hashtag RLFCollected on our social media channels. The music was composed by Andy Glenn. There was research by Nicola Baldwin and post-production by James Robertson. Our producer was Anne Morgan.